Alright, as you can see, this will be part 3 of chapter 14, of Jarrett, dealing with the 60s. Let us begin. We left off with number 27, Roe v. Wade. That is where we're going to begin. Roe v. Wade. In 1973, this was a Supreme Court case which overturned a Texas law against abortion. Now, to be fair, every state union had a law against abortion. Abortion is something that was outlawed across the country. It just happened to be a Texas law that made it to the court. And in this case, Roe v. Wade, 1973, the Supreme Court ruled that women had a constitutional right to privacy, which allowed them to abort a pregnancy. Pro-choice, meaning I get to choose to have the baby or abort it. Pro-choice became a rallying cry for the feminist movement. Now, we're not going to go into, at this time, the moral, the ethical arguments against abortion, for abortion. The concept of the privacy argument, that Supreme Court ruled that women had this constitutional right to privacy. That concept of privacy is based on a case, Supreme Court case that had been decided about 12, 15 years prior, dealing with contraceptives. Now, the Ninth Amendment to the Constitution states that there might be other rights that Americans, humans, are entitled to that are not specifically stated within the Constitution or within the Bill of Rights. So this is one of those examples where the court ruled that there is a right to privacy, again, a right that had never been used before. Let me erase that so we can make sure we can see it clearly, that there is a right to privacy which allowed women, this privacy allowed women the right to abort their pregnancy. Now, there has been attempts over the years to limit it. Pretty much, we have done away with the concept of partial birth abortion, which is an abortion in the final trimester, and we won't go into the actual practice and how it's done. That's something you can take up, or we can take up some other time, where you can learn on your own or figure it out on your own. But again, most people are opposed to partial birth, which again is in the final trimester, and there are some issues about who pays for it. Should the government pay for it? On and on and on. Again, this is an ever-growing, varying argument that, again, we're not going to get into a whole lot of at this moment. But what you do need to be aware of, again, Roe v. Wade, 1973, Supreme Court ruled that the Texas law against abortion was unconstitutional. Title IX. This is part of the Education Amendments Act of 1972, and there's a whole lot that goes with it. We're not going to get into all of it because it really isn't that relevant to us. But Title IX, which is a part of this larger law, banned sex discrimination based on one's gender is probably a better way to phrase it. It banned discrimination based on gender in educational institutions such as athletics. Prior to this law being enacted and carried out, enforced by the government, given by 1972, that was when Richard Nixon was in office, men's programs had more money spent on them. Men dominated athletics in the country, professional level, collegiate level, high school level, and lower. And Title IX basically states that there needs to be equal distribution of funds. Now, again, there are some requirements and some guidelines, on and on and on. But essentially, what it states, and I want to make it real, keep it as simple as possible, that if men have 10 athletic events that they can participate in, then women must have 10 as well. There has been a lot of controversy over it. There has been a lot of anger and animosity generated, more so at the collegiate level than at the public school level, but there has not been some at the public school level. But this is an attempt to continue, a continued attempt to ban discrimination based on one's gender. This just happens to look at athletics. Black Power, number 29. African Americans should use their votes to win concessions from the government, and that they should control their own communities, patronize their own businesses, and free themselves from the economic, cultural, and political domination of whites. This really started in the mid to late 60s as SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, that C should be capitalized, sorry about that, as the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, SNCC, was one of a number of college-level advocacy groups for African Americans. Now, SNCC became extremely militant, extremely radical, and eventually barred white participation within SNCC. SNCC is part of this Black Power movement. Now, we'll have a couple of things in a moment, the Nation of Islam and Malcolm X and a few others in the next slide or two. But what we're looking at is a growth of the civil rights movement, in which we're looking at many within the civil rights movement who are tired of the nonviolent, the non-aggressive, the civil disobedience of Martin Luther King, particularly after his assassination, his murder in 1968, and they wanted change now. So this Black Power movement started, and essentially blacks argued, African Americans argued, that they should control their own communities, patronize only black-owned businesses, and free themselves from economic, cultural, and political domination of whites. Now, whether this has been successful or not is highly debatable. You could argue that since the African American community in America votes 95+% for Democrats, well, you could argue that they're still on the Democrat plantation when they were slaves in the 1860s, and now they are somewhat enslaved to the Democrat Party policies. So, has Black Power been overtly successful? Well, there are many more African American business owners, many more African American college students, doctors, lawyers. I mean, I can go on and on and on. So there has been a huge growth of economic, cultural freedom. Again, if you wish to argue away from the political domination, away from, let's make it the domination of whites, you could argue that. But what we're looking at is the growth of the militancy of these groups like SNCC, who were a part of Black Power. Let's take a look at a couple more. On this next slide, we have number 31 there, Black Muslims. Now, we often refer to the Black Muslims today as the Nation of Islam. Okay, let me write that up there. The Nation of Islam. Hopefully that's all seen, easily seen by you. So the Nation of Islam is a more formal name for the Black Muslims. The Nation of Islam is still around today, and I will refer to them as both. Again, not trying to belittle either one of them, but again, I will use both terms. Originally, we called them the Black Muslims. The members of this group, believe that Islam should be the religion of African Americans, and that they should form their own state. You go back to Black Power, and we're looking really at a rebirth of segregation, but segregation of Plessy versus Ferguson was white forcing blacks to be segregated under people like Malcolm X, who was part of the Nation of Islam, part of the Black Muslims. they were now attempting to impose segregation upon their own people, whereas before, whites had wanted to be separate from blacks, had forced blacks to be separate. Now blacks are voluntarily segregating themselves from whites. And we'll get to Malcolm X in a moment. Let's go to 32nd one here, and the Black Panthers demanded that reparations, these are monetary payments for damages committed, be given to the black community for centuries of oppression. As you can well imagine, it didn't go very far, it didn't go over very well. It is difficult to blame whites of today for slavery of 200, 300, 400, 500, 1,000 plus years ago. But let's just take it a step further. You want to know one of the biggest runners of slavery 1,500 years ago? Muslims. Many of the African slaves that were brought to America were sold into slavery by members of Islam. So, who do we make pay reparations? Do we create a separate tax for it? Do we pay reparations to everyone who's African American? And what's an African American? President Obama has a white mother. His father was an African. Okay? Michael Jordan. I mean, his parents were both U.S. citizens. His family had been in the country for generations. Let's go to Hakeem Olajuwon, who is now, I believe, a U.S. citizen, a former basketball player at the University of Houston and the Houston Rockets. He is an African. He was born in Nigeria. So he's now a U.S. citizen. Does he get reparations even though his people never suffered any oppression because he is the first one of his family to be in America? So as you can well imagine, this didn't happen. And of course the Black Panthers used the argument, the United States paid reparations to the descendants, the survivors of the Japanese internment. But again, that's a completely different argument. So, all this is going on in the late 60s, early 70s. We got the Black Panthers, we got the Black Muslims, the Nation of Islam. We have Black Power blooming. We have Malcolm X and a few others that we will talk about and see as we go through the rest of the chapter, who are yelling, screaming, fighting for black freedom, black independence, black segregation. Okay. Let's talk about Malcolm X a little bit. Spokesman for the Black Muslims, okay, he questioned Martin Luther King's nonviolence. He believed that African Americans should meet violence with violence. Now again, I can't say I blame him. He urged blacks to patronize only black-owned businesses. Again, continuing with that self-induced segregation concept. After a change of heart, he was assassinated by the Black Muslims in 1965. Story's real simple. Malcolm X was a convert to Islam while he was in jail. He used the last name X because, as he said, he has no idea what his real name was. His slave name, whatever his real name was before he became Malcolm X, he rejected that, and since he had no idea what his real name was, since his great-great-great-great-grandparents, whatever it was, were kidnapped and brought here. So he used X because he didn't know his real name. He made the pilgrimage to Mecca, which is the holy city of Islam. Every Muslim is supposed to make that journey at least once. He went there. Again, his heart was filled with hatred and anger toward whites because of the way he had been treated in his life. And again, I can understand that. While at Mecca, he came to realize that Muslims aren't black. They're white, black, brown, green, pink, purple, probably some Martians. I mean, they come from all walks of life, all races, all nationalities. When he came back home and he started to preach, well, maybe whites aren't the devil. Not all whites are the devil. As he had called whites for years, all whites are the devil, he had proclaimed loudly. When he had that change heart that, well, maybe they're not all that bad, the Nation of Islam had him murdered. in front of his own family while he was at a speech, and I believe it was in Chicago. It may have been in Detroit. I apologize for not knowing the exact city. This is not really, it doesn't really matter. But the Nation of Islam had him assassinated in front of a group he was giving a speech in front of, including his wife and his children who were in the audience. Why? Because he didn't sing the company song. He didn't toe the company line. What was the black Muslims' company line? All whites are devils. Black-owned businesses were the only ones that you could patronize, and make sure we get this, violence was the key. Okay. Number 34, ghettos, slums, and decaying inner cities. Again, something we've talked about. We talked about the industrialization, urbanization of America several chapters ago. We talked about how different ethnic groups, when they came to America, would go to a big city. They would go to New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and find those little cultural, those little ethnic neighborhoods where they would find people like themselves, who spoke the same language, wore the same clothes, went to the same church, ate the same foods. Over the years, these little areas begin to decline, they begin to decay, and we refer to them as ghettos. And by and large, you will find mostly minorities within these ghettos. Chicanos, named for people of Hispanic descent. Again, we understand this, considering where we're at. And so I'm not going to go into any greater depth than that at this time. Let's move forward to our next page. I want to get a couple more done, 2 or 3 more done before we finish up with this particular video presentation. And we're at number 36, the Chicano movement. As I'm waiting for, there it is, my drawing mode. Okay. Its main focus was on such issues as farm workers voting and political rights. Cesar Chavez. Now, I took a class, my last class actually, in graduate school for my master's in history, and it was being taught by a professor at Pan Am, who's no longer with us. He unfortunately died a short time after that. Was doing an extensive biography of Cesar Chavez, and he always called him Caesar because he said that's what Chavez wanted to be called, by Caesar, not Cesar, but Caesar. Okay, and I must have read a dozen or more books on Chavez, and I heard some things and saw some videos and some other stuff that most people haven't seen or heard, and it was quite eye-opening. And we'll talk about him a little bit later on as we go. But part of this Chicano movement and part of this movement to aid farm workers was what Chavez was doing as an organizer of farm workers in California. And some of his people eventually worked here in Texas and other states, but primarily in California. Along with Dolores Huerta, Chavez and the United Farm Workers attempted to unionize farm workers in California again, and then other states as well, including Texas. Now, they did have some successes, and ultimately, unfortunately, they kind of failed. There's a lot of reasons for it. I'm not going to go into great depth and detail at the moment about Cesar Chavez and some of the things that he did, other than to say that eventually the entire concept of United Farm Workers and unionization sort of fell apart. Though still around today. It kind of lost its luster when Chavez kind of moved on to other things, and there's some other internal issues. Probably one of the bigger problems our nation has faced over the last 4 or 5 decades, I mean, there's a lot of them, but our farm workers. I mean, if your daddy is a farm worker, you're probably one, and then your children probably will be. Unlike many other areas where if you grow up in Kentucky and daddy's a coal miner, you can break that cycle and not be a coal miner. But with farm workers, it doesn't seem to work that way. And it's a very complex issue, and we don't have time to go into each and every aspect of it. But again, and I'm sure there are several of you in the audience who are watching this, listeners right now, are farm workers. I've had a number of students who have been farm workers and who have been in my class, been highly successful, graduated. I had a number of them in the top 10%, valedictorians, salutatorians. They've gone to all kinds of different colleges, UT, Harvard, Yale, Pan Am, all the great schools in the world. But it is difficult. And so one of the great failures of our nation over the course of the last several decades, 3 or 4 decades, was the United Farm Workers not being successful, not coming up with a permanent union that would then allow farm workers to be treated better, be paid better, and allow their children to overcome that cycle, which we do see in other fields, other endeavors like coal mining and those types of things. Okay. Let's go back to number 37. We skipped over to Hector Perez Garcia, a surgeon and World War II veteran, worked toward Hispanic rights and was the first Mexican-American to serve on the Commission of Civil Rights. So we're looking at a very accomplished individual, Hector Perez Garcia. He was a surgeon, World War II veteran, and eventually he served on the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. So again, this is just one of any number, millions actually, of Hispanics, Latinos, Chicanos, whichever term you wish to use, who were able to overcome, again, I don't know Mr. Garcia's story, but maybe his parents were farm workers, and he was able to overcome that and move out of the fields, which, as I said a little bit earlier, sometimes is hard to break that cycle. If he was a farm worker, and again, I don't know if he was, but he was able to break that cycle, and there have been lots of them who have. And who have gone on to become professionals, college graduates, doctors, lawyers, politicians, teachers. Anyway, let's move forward. Again, I want to get a couple more done here. Red Power, term used by Native Americans and their attempt to be treated equally. Now, the American Indian movement, which is where you get this phrase Red Power from, the American Indian movement was formed to mobilize public opinion, to get public opinion in favor of the natives by seeking greater respect for their heritage, and the American Indian movement protested against movies, books, TV shows, which they believed depicted an anti-Indian bias. So what we're looking at is the attempt by the American Indian movement, part of this growing Red Power in the late 60s, early 70s, and they were attempting to, I have a little bit of a problem here with my, there we go. Yeah, there we go. They were attempting to protest the way movies, books, TV shows depicted Indians, and that they were somewhat biased. And so there's any number of examples in old westerns, TV shows. Again, we in this country have been somewhat slow, or we were very slow early on in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, to cast minorities in shows. In fact, I saw one today. I was watching an old episode of the 1970s TV show Kung Fu about a half Chinese, half American who is in China and is trained by monks in the art of martial arts and philosophy. Comes to America looking for his half brother. Anyway, the point is, this was originally an idea pitched by Bruce Lee. He came up with the idea, but the TV networks wouldn't hire Bruce Lee because he was too Oriental looking. And of course, Bruce Lee is the greatest martial artist of all time. And so he looked too Asian. And so they cast, instead of Bruce Lee, they cast David Carradine. Now, David Carradine is a great actor, a great martial artist, but again, that shows some of this anti-minority bias that we had in our movies and our TV shows in the 40s, 50s, 60s, even up to the early 70s. Okay, we got one more slide. And we're going to take a look at 4 Supreme Court decisions and talk about them a little bit and how they specifically changed America. Okay, and let us start with number 42, Mendez versus Westminster School District. This is 1947. Led to the repeal of California's school segregation laws. And again, this is 1947. This is the year Jackie Robinson breaks the color barrier. We're still 7 years away from Brown versus the Board of Education, and most states who had a minority population had segregation laws. Now, unless these laws are now unconstitutional, unless there's a specific law stating children could be segregated. And that kind of gives the court in the states a way out. It's kind of wishy-washy, it's kind of wimpy. I mean, the practice is either bad or it's not bad. Well, it's bad unless you have a law saying, yeah, they can be segregated. So, I don't really like this one. Well, okay, what I like is irrelevant. I don't think this is a great decision by the courts. Keep in mind, courts only render opinions, decisions. They don't render law. It's not their job. Anyway, they repealed school segregation laws unless there was a specific law stating children could be segregated. So all you got to do now is come up with specific laws saying, yeah, we're going to segregate African Americans, we're going to segregate Mexican Americans, we're going to segregate, kids with 6 toes on 1 foot, blah, blah, blah. So again, unfortunately, all too often, our courts render opinions that lead to more questions. As opposed to providing clarity, they provide more murk. All right. Number 43, Delgado versus Bastrop, ISD. Bastrop, of course, here is in the state of Texas, 1948, just a year after Mendez. The Texas practice of segregating Mexican American children ended due to this case. So prior to Delgado, Mexican American children, Americans of Mexican descent, were segregated from whites, but that was ended due to Delgado. Huge step forward. Keep in mind, 1948, 1 year after Jackie Robinson, 6 years before Brown. So in some cases, we are a little bit ahead of the argument in terms of ending segregation. Was it still too little too late? Yeah. But it is a step in the right direction. Number 44, Hernandez versus Texas, 1954, the same year of Brown. And of course, this has nothing really to do with some of the things we've been mentioning, but okay, let's look at it. The court ruled that Mexican Americans were a separate class and not white, as the state argued, and therefore were entitled to protection under the 14th Amendment. Now again, I'm having some problems with my drawing. Let's see if we can get this thing cleared up. So, what Hernandez ruled, that Mexican Americans were a separate class of citizens. Again, growing up, I was taught that there's really only a couple different races. You have Caucasians, Africans, Native Americans, the Oriental, maybe even Eskimos as a fifth and final group. Okay. But what this case argued is that Mexican Americans were a separate class. And they weren't white, as the state argued. So therefore, they were entitled to protection under the 14th Amendment. Well, again, this kind of leaves a lot of questions to be asked because, number one, everyone should be protected under the 14th Amendment. Not just minorities. Though again, originally the 14th Amendment was aimed at the newly freed slaves. And it has been used a number of times to aid in the equal protection, the due process for minorities. But saying now that Mexican Americans are not white, and therefore they are now entitled, well, they were entitled to equal protection, to due process under the 14th Amendment. They were entitled to the provision dealing with birth. If they were born on U.S. territory, then they were U.S. citizens. So therefore, everything in the Constitution, including the 14th Amendment, they're entitled to. Again, a little bit of a problem. with the lack of clarity. White versus Register, 1973. The court ruled that the multi-member legislative districts, a legislative district from a state in which there were multi-members, I mean, you can get more than one person from it, eliminated chances for minorities to be elected. Now, again, what we're looking for more representation of minorities in the legislative branch. The state was ordered to set up single member districts, thereby giving minorities more of a chance to be elected. So you would have a district, let's say, again, we're in the 15th district in the state of Texas. And so let's say that the 15th district would have 2 members coming from it. Now, of course, in the Valley, we are heavily Hispanic heavy. Far more Hispanics in the Valley than any other type of nationality, ethnic group, or whatever. But let's go to the great Amarillo, Lubbock, Austin, Houston, where there are large numbers of whites, far more than you find here in the Valley. And so under these multi-member districts, it was likely, again, let's just say the district in Austin, which is a better example than what I gave you from District 15 a moment ago. Sorry about that. And so let's say that the Austin District number 10, I'm making up a number here, that they get 3 representatives. And since there are 3 times the number of whites in that district in the other minority group, then that district is going to more than likely send 3 white candidates to the state legislature, or even to the national legislature. So what the state was ordered to do by the Supreme Court case, White versus Register, states were ordered to set up single-member districts. You have 1 representative from each district. And if that district is has a heavy minority population, like in the Valley, like in certain parts of Houston and Dallas and other larger cities, whether those minorities are Hispanic or black is irrelevant. You would therefore give those minorities a greater chance to be elected, which was the whole idea behind the White versus Register Supreme Court case. Okay, we're going to pause it right there. So we have just finished part 3 of chapter 14. It's a little over 30 minutes, 32 minutes. A little lengthy, but again, there's a lot of them. We hopefully will finish it up in 1 or 2 more videos. So with that happy thought,